Walter Kessler was fired at 8:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in Hangar 7 at Solberg Defense Systems in Wichita, Kansas, over a bolt that cost $1.12. 4 days later, that same bolt froze a $2.5 billion defense contract. Chief Executive Renata Solberg stood on the hangar floor in front of 40 employees, 3 Army liaisons, and 2 reporters. She held up the small silver bolt Walter had pulled from the tail hinge of the F-19 Kestrel prototype. She asked the room a single question. Was the company really going to stop a $2.5 billion program over a part cheaper than a cup of coffee? Walter did not answer right away. He had already sealed a second bolt, the one still bolted to the hinge, inside a clear evidence bag. He wrote the date, the time, and his signature on the label. 8:09 a.m., Walter Kessler. That bag would matter more than anyone in that room understood. Renata tore the red inspection tag off the airframe herself. She ordered the line back to work. Then she looked at Walter and said the words that would later be replayed in a federal hearing room. "You're done here." Walter did not argue. He had worked at Solberg for 11 years. He walked past his toolbox, past his locker, past the men who would not meet his eyes, and out through the same gate he had entered every morning since 2015. He did not know yet that the hinge bolt in his evidence bag would end up on a conference table in front of the Department of Defense. He did not know the vibration chamber test was already running again. And in 96 hours, that replacement bolt would snap. Walter Kessler's apartment sat 11 miles from Hangar 7, on the second floor of a building on East Harry Street in Wichita. Rent, $940 a month. He had lived there since 2019, the year his wife, Marilyn, died of a stroke at age 41. Their daughter Grace was 12 at the time. Grace was 19 now, in her second year studying mechanical engineering at Wichita State University, 20 minutes from the apartment. Walter paid $6,200 a semester for her tuition, in installments, on the 15th of every month. He had not missed a payment in 4 years. Before Marilyn died, Walter was a senior reliability engineer at Solberg with a corner desk and his name on 3 certified fatigue testing protocols still used in the plant today. After her death, he asked to be moved to floor inspection, a lower title, a fixed shift, no travel, no late nights. It let him make Grace's breakfast at 6:40 a.m. and be home by 4:30 p.m. He never explained the demotion to anyone at Solberg. Most of the newer hires assumed he had always been an inspector. He wore the same gray uniform every day. He clocked in at 7 a.m. and clocked out at 3:30 p.m. He never asked for overtime pay, and he never turned in a report late. When younger technicians joked about Walter and his red tags, he said nothing back to them. He simply kept working. On the shelf above his workbench at home sat a single piece of paper, the original 2016 fatigue tolerance spec for the F-19 tail hinge assembly, still bearing his signature. Grace had asked him once why he kept it. He told her it reminded him what the standard used to be. Nobody at Solberg in 2026 knew that spec existed. In 6 days, that missing piece of paper would matter more than anyone in the boardroom could imagine.
9 days before he was fired, Walter Kessler stood at Station 4 in Hangar 7 running his final pre-vibration inspection of the F-19 Kestrel prototype's tail hinge assembly. It was 6:52 a.m. on a Sunday. Most of the plant was empty except for the overnight security guard and a single overhead light bank running at half power. Walter had inspected this exact hinge assembly 11 times before on 11 other airframes. He knew the certified bolt by feel before he ever looked at it. A dull matte gray finish, a manufacturer stamp reading SK4471 pressed into the head, a specific weight of 14 grams. The bolt seated in this hinge weighed the same, but the finish had a faint sheen under the worklight, almost silver instead of gray. He turned it under the lamp for 6 seconds. No stamp. He set it down on his inspection tray and picked up the next one from the parts bin beside the station, the one meant to replace it during reassembly. Same sheen, same missing stamp. He walked to the supply room, badge swiped in at 7:04 a.m., and pulled the batch log for hinge assembly fasteners. The batch number etched into the bolt did not match any entry in the certified supplier database. It did not exist. In the back corner of the supply room, behind a shelf of approved stock, sat a half-open cardboard box, no military markings, a commercial hardware label, $1.12 per unit, sold through a supplier called Ferrobolt and Fastener Co. out of Joplin, Missouri. Walter carried one bolt from that box back to his station and placed it beside the certified original. Under the light, they looked almost identical. He photographed both. He logged the batch numbers, the time, and the shelf location. Then he checked the delivery schedule. The certified supplier had missed a shipment 3 months earlier, on April 2nd. The Ferrobolt shipment arrived 4 days after that, on April 6th. Nobody else on the floor noticed. Walter had 9 days left before anyone would listen to him, and by then 6,000 more of these bolts would already be sitting inside the fleet. Walter Kessler filed his first internal flag at 7:41 a.m. that same Sunday through Solberg's standard quality hold system. He did not call it sabotage. He did not call it fraud. He wrote 4 lines. Unstamped fastener found at Station 4. Batch number does not match certified supplier records. Recommend full inventory audit of hinge assembly stock. Recommend hold on vibration testing pending review. By Monday morning, the flag reached his shift supervisor, a man named Dale Pruitt, who'd run Station 4 for 6 years. Dale read the report standing at his desk, coffee in hand, and told Walter the batch number was probably a clerical error, a typo from receiving, nothing more. Dale had seen typos like this before. He said the hinge bolts all came from the same approved vendor list, and that list didn't change with 3 signatures. He told Walter to log it as resolved and move on. Walter asked Dale to physically weigh the bolt from Station 4 against a certified sample. Dale did not have time before the noon production meeting. He told Walter he'd get to it this week. On Tuesday, Preston Halbrook, the chief operating officer, reviewed the flag during a routine quality summary, one of 40 similar tickets that crossed his desk that week. Preston read Walter's 4 lines in under 20 seconds. He noted that Walter had never once in 9 years at Solberg filed a flag that led to a supplier being replaced. He assumed, reasonably by his own account, that this was another case of an inspector being cautious past the point of usefulness. Preston closed the ticket with a single line, "No corrective action required. Proceed with scheduled testing." 3 days after that, the vibration chamber test began on schedule at 9 a.m. on Friday, with Army liaisons already seated in the observation gallery. Nobody had weighed the bolt. Nobody had opened the Ferrobolt box in the supply room a second time, and 96 hours later, at 5:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, that same hinge assembly would fail inside the chamber exactly the way Walter had predicted it would, 4 days before anyone fired him for saying so.
Walter Kessler left Hangar 7 for the last time as an employee at 8:19 a.m. on Tuesday, 5 minutes after Renata Solberg fired him in front of the assembled liaisons. He drove home, sat at his kitchen table, and sealed the pulled hinge bolt inside a chain of custody evidence bag, the same kind he had used for 9 years of documented inspections. He labeled it 8:09 a.m., Walter Kessler, Station 4 Hinge Assembly. At 11:50 a.m., he filed a formal report through the Defense Contract Oversight Portal, a channel reserved for verified safety concerns rather than internal grievances. He attached his photographs from 9 days earlier, the mismatched batch number, the Ferrobolt shipping label, the delivery date gap between April 2nd and April 6th. Inside the plant, that same report was edited at 12:04 p.m. Its severity classification changed from critical, material safety, to minor, documentation discrepancy. The change was logged under an administrative account, not a named employee. At 1:15 p.m.,
The vibration chamber test resumed on the F-19 Kestrel prototype using a replacement hinge bolt pulled from the same half-open ferrobolt box in the supply room. A lab technician named Corbin Ash, who ran the vibration monitoring station, noticed at 6:40 p.m. that the batch number written on the test tracking sheet had been changed by hand in handwriting that did not match any of the plant's standard entry forms. When he asked Preston Halbrook, Preston told him Renata had already signed off and that further questions were not necessary. At home that evening, Grace called her father between classes. Walter told her only that there had been a disagreement about a technical issue. Grace, a year into her mechanical engineering coursework, reminded him of something he had told her when she was 12. A measurement does not change because someone in charge dislikes the result. At 5:14 a.m. that Friday, 96 hours into the restarted test, the replacement hinge bolt sheared clean through inside the vibration chamber. The tail assembly shifted 0.6 degrees off-axis before the chamber's automatic shutdown triggered. No one was hurt, the aircraft never left the ground, but by 9 a.m., Corbin Ash had already sealed the failed bolt in an evidence bag of his own and sent 4 photographs of the fracture surface to a phone number he still had saved under one name, Walter Kessler. Walter Kessler's phone buzzed at 9:07 a.m. on Friday with 4 photographs from Corbin Ash. He opened them at his kitchen table in the East Harry Street apartment. The fracture surface on the replacement bolt showed a crack that started in the threaded load-bearing section and spread outward in a pattern he recognized instantly, the same failure mode from a near-miss batch of mislabeled rivets he had traced back in 2013, 13 years earlier, while still a certified reliability engineer at Solberg. Walter called Corbin back at 9:15 a.m. He told him 3 things: do not move the failed bolt from its sealed bag, do not sign anything that had already been altered, and photograph the tracking sheet exactly as it was before anyone had a chance to change it again. At 10:30 a.m., Preston Halbrook arrived at the test bay and proposed logging the failure as a rig malfunction rather than a component failure. He suggested a quiet swap and a restart of the test clock with no notice to the Department of Defense. Renata approved the plan by 10:52 a.m., citing the oversight audit scheduled to arrive in 48 hours. But by 11:40 a.m., the Defense Contract Oversight Office had already received Walter's earlier report, the one filed 4 days before the failure, at 11:50 a.m. on the day he was fired. Claire Donnelly, lead auditor for the oversight agency, called Solberg directly and ordered an immediate halt to all testing activity, effective that hour, pending an in-person inspection. Renata's communications staff began drafting talking points describing Walter as a disgruntled former employee. Claire made it clear on the same call that her audit would not stop at one broken bolt. It would trace the entire supply chain feeding the F-19 program from the ground up. At 8 a.m. the next morning, Claire arrived at Solberg's gate with an independent audit team of 6. She asked for 3 documents: the failed bolt, the original purchase order, and the first inspection report ever filed on the incident. The 3 documents contained 3 different batch numbers, and at 9:45 a.m. she asked to see the man who filed the original flag, the same man Solberg's security badge system still listed in its own internal record as terminated, effective immediately.
Walter Kessler walked back through Solberg's front gate at 10:20 a.m. on Saturday, 3 days after security had walked him out. Claire Donnelly had requested him by name. Renata Solberg seated him at the far end of the 22-foot conference table and introduced him to the room only as a former employee recently terminated. Walter said nothing about the introduction. He placed the $1.12 commercial bolt beside a certified aerospace equivalent on the table and explained in under 4 minutes the difference in alloy, heat treatment, coating, and fatigue rating. Claire ordered a full inspection of the supply warehouse at 11 a.m. By 3:40 p.m., her team had found 6,400 uncertified bolts mixed directly into bins of certified stock across 64 separate airframes already in production, not just the F-19 prototype in the test chamber. At 2:15 p.m., Gideon Marsh, Solberg's supply chain director, told investigators the substitution was the unauthorized act of a single warehouse employee. But Claire's team pulled the purchase order Claire's team pulled at 2:50 p.m., carried Gideon's own signature, dated March 29th, ordering 8,000 units from Faro Bolt and Fastener Co. at $1.12 each, a total of $8,960 against a certified parts cost that would have run $344,000. At 4:10 p.m., Claire opened the original 2016 design specification file for the hinge assembly and asked the room who had written it. Dr. Laurel Voss, the F-19's lead engineer, answered, Walter Kessler. The room went quiet. Every person who had dismissed the quiet inspector in the gray uniform now understood they had fired the engineer who wrote the exact safety standard they had just violated. At 4:45 p.m., a junior auditor pulled an archived file from 2013, Walter's own prototype failure report from 13 years earlier, describing an almost identical fatigue fracture in a different airframe's control bracket. Renata argued the old file had no bearing on the current issue, but Nathaniel Cobb, Solberg's board chairman, sitting at the head of the table, had already started writing his own notes, the kind that suggested his loyalty to Renata was no longer guaranteed. By 6 p.m., Claire's team had traced the same Faro Bolt supplier into two other active defense programs at Solberg, unrelated to the F-19 entirely. The $2.5 billion contract was no longer the only thing at risk. Every certification Solberg had ever submitted to the federal government was now in question, and the Department of Defense's final ruling was due in 72 hours. At 8:30 a.m. Sunday, Preston Halbrook met Walter Kessler alone in a conference room with no camera running. He offered reinstatement, a $28,000 raise, and a newly created title, Director of Quality, on one condition. Walter would tell the Department of Defense the failed bolt was an isolated shipping error, nothing more. Walter asked what would happen to the 6,400 uncertified bolts, still in 64 airframes. Preston admitted the plan was to replace them quietly after the contract payment cleared. Walter declined. He told Preston a title meant nothing if it required his signature on a lie. Renata Solberg tried next at 9:10 a.m., warning that if the contract collapsed, 1,400 Solberg employees could lose their jobs. Walter answered that leadership put those jobs at risk the moment it chose to hide a known defect instead of fixing it. When Renata invoked grace, reminding him he was a single father who needed this job, Walter told her his daughter needed a father who told the truth more than she needed one who got paid to certify a lie. The full board hearing convened at 10 a.m. Monday, with Department of Defense counsel and Claire Donnelly present. Renata described Walter as a disgruntled former employee acting out of personal grievance until Claire played the security footage of the day of his termination. Every board member in the room heard Renata's own voice, a piece of metal cheaper than breakfast. Claire laid out the timeline without embellishment, minute by minute. The missed April 2nd shipment, Gideon's March 29th order to Faro Bolt, Laurel's written fatigue testing warning, Renata's email reply stating Solberg could not afford to sacrifice a $2.5 billion contract over differences that exist only on paper. Walter's termination, the altered severity rating logged 4 minutes after his badge was deactivated, and the failure at 5:14 a.m. Friday, exactly as Walter had predicted, 13 years after he'd first documented the same fatigue fracture. Corbin Ash confirmed under questioning that Preston had instructed him to delete the high-speed camera footage. Gideon admitted under oath to relabeling the Faro Bolt boxes at Preston's direction. At 11:52 p.m., Nathaniel Cobb asked Renata directly why she had fired Walter on the spot if she hadn't understood the severity of his report. She had no answer that wasn't an admission. At noon, the Department of Defense representative announced the $2.5 billion contract was terminated effective immediately. All falsified certification records would be forwarded to federal contract fraud investigators. By 2 p.m., the board voted to suspend Renata Solberg. Preston Halbrook and Gideon Marsh were terminated outright.
Solberg Defense Systems recalled all 6,400 uncertified bolts over the following 5 months at a cost of $2.1 million. Not one aircraft had left the ground with a compromised part. Not a single life had been put at risk. The board offered Walter Kessler the newly created title of Vice President of Quality. He turned it down within a week, telling Nathaniel Cobb that replacing one person with unchecked power with another person holding the same power would fix nothing. Instead, he agreed to build an independent safety division, reporting directly to the board rather than to any single executive. One with the authority to halt production on its own judgment, report directly to government customers without executive filtering, and disclose any material substitution before it reached a customer. Solberg lost the F-19 program permanently. Its civilian aviation contracts were allowed to continue once the restructuring was independently verified, a process that took 11 months. 6 months after his termination, Walter walked back through the same gate at Hangar 7, still in the same gray uniform, having chosen the inspection floor over an office. Grace, now in her 3rd year at Wichita State, came to the opening of the new Material Inspection Lab, quietly named for the certification standards her father had written in 2016. She didn't say much that day. She didn't need to. Corbin Ash was promoted to head the newly independent test division. Dr. Laurel Voss resigned from her position as lead engineer, telling a room of younger engineers months later that her silence had made her complicit in something she could no longer defend. Renata Solberg appeared once at a shareholder meeting and admitted she had dismissed Walter because of his title and his circumstances rather than the substance of what he said. She was never reinstated. On the new production floor, a young inspector once stopped an entire line over a washer with a slightly different sheen than spec called for. Nobody mocked him. Walter walked over, checked it under a lamp, confirmed it fell within tolerance, and the line restarted within the hour. Nobody complained about the lost time. By then, everyone on that floor understood exactly what a small, overlooked detail could become. Walter placed the original $1.12 bolt in a glass case in the training center. Beneath it, a brass plate reads, "The price of a single part may only be $1.12. The price of ignoring the person who noticed it can be an entire company." He never gave interviews. He still clocks in at 7 a.m. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life who was overlooked but never wrong, someone whose quiet competence held everything together while nobody noticed, tell us about them in the comments. Like this video if you believe recognition should be earned, not demanded, and subscribe because the next story is waiting.